Welcome back to Disciple Dojo in our continuing guided tour through the days of creation, where we do sort of a deep dive into Genesis 1. In our first video in the series, we talked about some foundational issues in terms of genre, in terms of how the text is approached and how it's been read throughout history. And in this one, we're going to actually look at some linguistic aspects, some Hebrew literary characteristics of the text. And before we do that, real quick, you know what I'm going to say. If you haven't subscribed already, what are you waiting for? Come on. All the cool kids are subscribed to Disciple Dojo. You don't want to be left out, do you? What's wrong with you? I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. No, but seriously, we are trying to grow this channel. One of our goals for the end of this year is to have 20,000 subscribers. We're well on our way towards getting there, but we need your help. So if you haven't already, tap subscribe, click that little notifications icon. All of that really helps us out, as do those of you who support us financially. Disciple Dojo is a nonprofit 501c3. All of what we do is donor-based. We don't have any funding from any organizations, grants, anything like that. Everything we do is grassroots donor-funded. So if you'd like to become a Dojo donor, we would very much welcome that at whatever amount you can give, a few bucks a month or significantly more. We just ask that if you appreciate this ministry and you want to help us continue to equip, engage, and empower God's people through biblical discipleship resources, then that's a great way you can help us do just that. Okay, let's continue getting a lay of the land as we approach Genesis 1. So the last video, we talked a little bit about genre and questions of what type of writing is Genesis, and we haven't answered those questions. These videos, we're raising the questions so that when you are reading the text on your own, when you're studying the text, when you're listening to commentary or preachers, when you're taking a class and Genesis is talked about, you'll have sort of like a lay of the land where you can say, okay, these are the basic approaches. These are the questions that any approach needs to be able to answer. These are some things to be aware of. And that's helpful with any literature, but in particular with scripture. Now, in this video, what I want to talk about are some of the Hebrew language considerations that we have to take into account. Genesis was not written in English. Genesis was written in ancient biblical Hebrew. Now, we know that, most people know that at least, and most people can't read ancient biblical Hebrew. So what do? Well, you read a translation. Ideally, if you can't read Hebrew, you should be reading multiple translations. And if you're watching this video on YouTube, there's no reason why you can't read multiple translations, because that means you have internet access. And if you have internet access, you have access to things like YouVersion app on your phone, or Bible Hub, or Bible Gateway, or Biblia, or Step Bible. These are all resources free on the line right now, where you at the click of a mouse or the tap of a finger can see any passage of the Bible in numerous translations. And that's what you need to be doing. If you do not read Hebrew, you need to be reading from multiple translations so that you can get a sense of what translators and scholars of Genesis working together in community with each other. You should always use Bible translations made by multiple translators, not just one person. You get a sense of what all of these scholars and interpreters and linguists are trying to bring out from that original Hebrew text, because there's more than one way to say something from one language to another. You can translate something from one language into another language in numerous different ways. And that's why translation is more of an art than a science. So there's some things that we need to know about the Hebrew language, particularly as we read Genesis 1, that will help us from getting derailed or sidetracked or embracing something that would have been completely foreign to the original ancient hearers and readers. So let's talk about some Hebrew language considerations. The first is fluid and flexible vocabulary. There are numerous terms, particularly in Genesis 1, that can be translated in different ways in English because English doesn't have an exact equivalent, or because English has numerous equivalents for that particular word. So here are some examples. The word yom, the Hebrew word yom, sometimes it means day, like a 24-hour period. Sometimes it means just daylight, like when God calls the light day, he's just talking about the daytime as opposed to the night. So it doesn't mean 24 hours. And then sometimes yom is used to denote a long period of time or an overall account. So in Genesis 2:4, at the end of this section, it says, in the day of God's creating the heavens and the earth. And that gets translated in some English translations as when God created the heavens and the earth. So day can have multiple different meanings, even in the same passage. Another example is the word Shemayim. Shemayim is the sky, or it's the heavens, like where the stars and the planets are, or Shemayim means heaven, like where God and his heavenly host dwell. And there's no real clear distinction, especially early in biblical Hebrew, between these other than context. So context will determine if something should be translated as heavens or sky or heaven itself, where God dwells. And the same for the word land, eretz, or when it's definite, haaretz, the land, or it can mean earth. It's the solid ground as opposed to the sky or the sea. So the realms of creation, you've got the underworld, then you have the sea, and then you have the land, and then you have the heavens. And these are broad categories and broad concepts. So sometimes eretz means land, not the entire earth, and it certainly doesn't mean globe in the minds of most ancient hearers, because that concept would come later in human discovery through the sciences and through mathematics of the ancient Greeks. But eretz itself just denoted land, the stuff we're standing on, not the oceans, not the sky. And the word ruach. Ruach in Hebrew is the word that means spirit. It can also mean wind, and it can also mean breath. You see in Ezekiel in the dry bones encounter, where he prophesies to the wind and then the breath comes. And this is all an image of God's spirit coming and dwelling among his people. This plays up all the semantic range that the word ruach has. Well, in Genesis 1, is ruach describing the spirit of God, or is it describing the wind of God or a mighty wind? These are questions that aren't answered at the level of lexical definition, but rather context will determine which of these shades of meaning we're looking at. So keep in mind, Hebrew has fluid and flexible language and vocabulary. Hebrew also uses things like merism and phenomenological language. So merism is describing something by talking about its opposites. An example right in Genesis is heavens and earth. Heavens and earth, or the heavens and the earth, hashamayim v'haaretz, that is a merism that denotes everything. It's a shorthand way of saying everything. In modern English, examples of merism would be from A to Z, or from the cradle to the grave. We're talking about the two parts of the extreme, like the cradle where baby is laid, and the grave where you are laid when you die. And that denotes everything in between. It means all of life. So Hebrew has these same concepts, and we need to be aware when something is being used as a figure of speech, as a merism, or if it's technical, specific language. The same goes for phenomenological language. Phenomenological language is describing something as it appears to a typical observer in ordinary everyday language, not describing it as it scientifically or philosophically is at the foundational level. So the example in English that comes to mind would be the phrase sunset or sunrise. We know that the sun doesn't actually set and it doesn't actually rise. The earth is spinning and it just looks like the sun is moving because we're the ones that are moving. But it doesn't mean we're scientifically illiterate if we use the word sunset or sunrise instead of wavelength of light refracting through an atmosphere at an angle of such and such. No, we just say sunset. Wow, that's a pretty sunset. Oh, the sunrise was gorgeous this morning. It's just phenomenological language, everyday language describing something as it appears to a normal human observer. And one of the examples in Genesis 1, I think, is the term rakia. The rakia is the firmament or the expanse, depending on the translation you're reading. And it describes this dome, vault, expanse, space, atmosphere. There's no English equivalent to the Hebrew word rakia. And so when we come to that and we read that that's what God made and then called the sky, we have to take into account, is this phenomenological language? Is this describing some actual solid dome that surrounds the earth up in the heavens and holds back a literal ocean? Or is that phenomenological language, poetic language, artistic language, describing what it looks like when you look up above and you see a bunch of blue and sometimes some of it falls on your head and waters your crops? That's a question that you'll have to wrestle with at the level of interpretation. But it's worth keeping in mind that the Hebrew language uses these concepts just as any other language does. Another thing to take into account is Hebrew has extremely limited verb tenses. Verbs that are either perfect, they describe an action that from the mind of the speaker has been completed. Doesn't necessarily mean it's past tense, it just means it's a completed action. Or there are verbs that are imperfect. And that means that they describe an action that is not completed. Doesn't necessarily mean it's a future action. It just means that in the mind of the speaker, the action they're describing is not a completed action. And then you have an infinitive, and that's just the generic, like to be, to live, to laugh, to jump, to pray. It's just the bare verbal concept itself in its most unadorned form. And then you have participles, something describing ongoing action that in the mind of the speaker is currently happening, running, jumping, playing, worshiping. So Hebrew really just has these four in terms of tenses available to use to describe all manner of events, past, present, and future. And so because of this, it's not always easy to tell the chronology in Hebrew passages. And on top of that, sometimes Hebrew intentionally uses either recapitulation or dyschronologization. In other words, describing something intentionally not in chronological order, but out of chronological order. Now, this can start to get woefully grammatically nerdy. And my Hebrew grammar level is intermediate at best. So you would need to look to some of the grammarians on the shelf behind me for in-detailed arguments and presentations of this stuff. And I know I'm probably misspeaking on some of the grammatical terms. So Hebrew grammar nerds, just bear with me. I'm trying to present this to people who don't know anything about the language. But we see examples in Scripture where things are told not in the order that they happen, A, then B, then C. But rather we see an event is described. And then in the next section, the narrator jumps back and describes that event either again or a specific part of that event or something about that event that he didn't describe the first time. And there's a really easy example of this that's readily apparent in the Hebrew Bible in the next book, in Exodus. In Exodus 19, when Israel comes to Mount Sinai, chapter 19, verse 1, let me show you 3 different translations and how they handled this one verb in Exodus 19. So in Exodus 19, in verses 1 and 2, there's this verb, vayisu. And the verb comes from nasa, and it means to set out, to break camp, to pull up stakes and move on. So it refers to departing or setting out or breaking camp. And if you read the Legacy Standard Bible, and I just grabbed this one because it's purported to be sort of a literal translation, you read Exodus 19:1, in the 3rd month after the sons of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on this day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. Then they set out from Rephidim and came to the wilderness of Sinai and camped in the wilderness. And there Israel camped in front of the mountain. So this seems to say that Israel came to Sinai and then set out and then again came to Sinai. So it's saying this happened, then this happened, then this happened. Now, when you compare that to the New American Standard, very similar translation to the Legacy Standard, it says, in the 3rd month after the sons of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that very day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. When they set out from Rephidim, they came to the wilderness of Sinai and camped in the wilderness, and there Israel camped in front of the mountain. So in the New American Standard, this setting out is describing again this initial action. In the 3rd month, after they had gone out of the land of Egypt, they came to the wilderness of Sinai. And then it's recapitulating. It's telling another shade of what happened. When they set out from Rephidim, so it's giving you where they came to Sinai from. They came to the wilderness of Sinai. So Legacy Standard is saying they did this and then they set out and came there again. You have it happening twice up here in the Legacy Standard. In the New American Standard, it uses this word when to translate the verb. And then when you compare that to the New King James Version, the King James does as well. The New King James is just a little clearer in English, modern English. We read, in the 3rd month after the children of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on the same day they came to the wilderness of Sinai, for they had departed from Rephidim, had come to the wilderness of Sinai, and camped in the wilderness. So Israel camped there before the mountain. The New King James renders this as a pluperfect. They had departed. They had come to the wilderness. This is in English a pluperfect. So all three of these are ways of translating this one Hebrew verb, vayasu. And grammatically, all three of these are correct. But contextually, that is very unlikely. And the New King James actually pulls out or interprets a little more into English what the New American Standard says, but doesn't make absolutely clear. So this isn't to endorse any of those three translations. In fact, those are probably three of the translations I use the least, but they do a great job of illustrating how you can, even in literal translations, which all three of those claim to be, how you can take a single Hebrew verb and render it in English, because Hebrew verbs are much less precise in terms of their tense than English verbs are. And so you have to let context determine how you translate a particular verb in a particular passage. Another thing linguistically, vocabulary-wise, to keep in mind are the covenant terms that Genesis 1 is filled with. See, if we read Genesis 1 as just modern readers, I'm picking up the Bible, I want to learn what it says about the creation of the world, and you start reading, we'll probably gloss over a number of terms that the original Israelite readers would have readily picked up on. I mean, these terms are loaded with meaning in ancient Israelite ears because the ancient Israelites were the people of the covenant. They were the people whom God had entered into covenant with at Sinai. They were the people who were the seed of Abraham, who God had made promises to. They lived in the world of the covenant. And therefore, Genesis 1 is introducing the God of the covenant. And so it's loaded with terms that have later covenantal importance. Here are some examples. Terms in Genesis that reverberate with covenant significance would be land, the aretz. The concept of the land was a dominant concept in ancient Israel. The promised land, the land, haaretz. This word echoing over and over again. It has importance for Israel. The word seed. Seed appears so many times in the initial creation account. Literally seed, like what plants produce. And yet that's what God will make a promise to Abraham's seed later in Genesis. The seed of the woman in Genesis chapter 3. Seed becomes one of the main terms to describe offspring. In fact, in biblical Hebrew, the word seed is also just the generic word for offspring or descendants. It's also the literal word for semen, human seed, so to speak. So the word seed has extreme significance in the Hebrew thought world, as does the word blessing. You read of God blessing things in the creation account, and the Abrahamic blessing, the blessing that Jacob gives to his 12 sons, the blessing that Aaron pronounces over the congregation. The concept of blessing is going to be incredibly important as the narrative of Genesis unfolds and throughout the rest of Scripture, as will the notion of governing or ruling over, especially later when messianic concepts come into play. The words having to do with time, like days and years and seasons and months, You find these in Genesis 1, and the concept of Sabbath at the end of the Genesis 1 account. Sabbath is a crucial term. It's emphasized numerous times, even in Genesis 1, and it was one of the fundamental characteristics that set the Hebrew people apart from their ancient Near East neighbors. And the command that God gives different elements of creation to be fruitful and multiply. He commands it to some of the creatures. He commands it to the man and the woman. This is going to be one of the things that God tells Abraham that's going to happen to his descendants, his seed. They're going to be numerous. They're going to multiply. They're going to fill the land. These are terms that will have later impact, later significance as the biblical narrative unfolds. And we see them right here in Genesis chapter 1. Now, in the next video in this series, we're going to look at this first creation day. We're going to look at the different aspects that come into play. We're going to walk through the text. But this video and the previous video in this series are to set the stage. They're to get you in the mindset of reading Genesis 1, not as modern scientific description, not as creation science, not as a manifesto about astrophysics or Big Bang cosmology or evolution or geology, none of that. They're to help us enter into the world of the ancient reader, the ancient hearer, the people to whom this was originally taught and given and repeated and carried on, and what became foundational to their identity, who they were as God's people. That's what we want to do when we read any biblical passage, and especially one as foundational as the opening chapter of the first book of the Torah. So stay tuned. In the next episode, we're going to dig into the actual text of Genesis 1. In the meantime, continue what I suggested in the last video. Grab multiple translations of Genesis 1 and read through it in all different translations. Those of you that read Hebrew, obviously, read it in Hebrew. Although if you read Hebrew, I probably don't have to tell you to read Genesis 1 in Hebrew because you've probably read it many times before in Hebrew. But this will be a good chance to review it for those of you who your Hebrew was many, many moons ago, back in your college or seminary days. Thanks for watching. We'll see you back here next time at Disciple Dojo. As always, keep training.